Session 1 started with our group of adventurers on a caravan with Erin Marlowe. She had a last minute change of plans and needed to hire a group of adventurers, our party, to aid her in taking her 2 wagons to Emberwood. And she needed to get a move on immediately. Our party begins their trek to Emberwood. On their way, they are accosted by a small group of bandits who, at a nearby intersection, demand a toll. Harmon asks Mrs. Marlowe if this is something that is normal, if she normally has to pay a toll. And Marlowe reveals no, she's never had to pay a toll on her way to Emberwood. The group jumps off the wagons and moves to confront this group of bandits. In the book, it says that they need 3 successes to convince these bandits to leave them be, or they're gonna pick a fight. Very quickly, Noct uses some very quiet intimidation. He's that Elandrian elf with a little bit of assistance from a very bulky barbarian woman named Morgan. They end up getting 1 success in the realm of intimidation. He kind of just stands there quietly looking down his nose at these people while Morgan stands there looking a little bit more bulky next to him. Harmon ends up using a little bit of persuasion, trying instead to warn them not to pick a fight with them, kind of, motioning to those 2 really creepy the creepy fellow and the big lady behind him. And our final success comes from actually our 10-year-old Zelda, who uses thaumaturgy in the bushes to try to frighten the bandits into retreat, which was 100% her idea. I kind of half expected them to pursue. I did prepare a little hideout for the bandits where they could essentially acquire some loot if they decided to go after them, but they did not, and instead decided that it was more important to get Marlowe to where she needed to be. The weather is nice. They continue to move on closer and closer to Emberwood, but as they get closer and closer, wildlife starts disappearing. There's less farmland, there's less people, more ramshackle housing. They end up settling down at night, that night at camp. This is where Marlowe starts asking them more about, why each of them are traveling to Drakkenheim. Why are they going to Emberwood? What are they looking to do? And of course, most of the party kind of keeps their lips shut, not really wanting to reveal their personal quests too soon. Though Harmon admits immediately that he's looking for prey, and Morgan is saying she's just following the money. As they kind of finish sharing those stories, a small group approaches the camp. Morgan, blissfully unaware of the approaching group, even though he was on duty. The 3 newcomers are exhausted, beat up adventurers. One is wearing a cloak that's covering most of his body, and they are nearly upon camp before anybody even realizes. They ask if there's any room for them at the fire, and of course, the group says sure, though hesitantly, and Morgan does reach for her weapons just in case. The main speaker introduces himself as Ludwig, and his friends are Endra and Rakan. Endra just kind of nods quietly to everyone. She seems a little bit more quiet. Rakan doesn't seem to even reply. He almost seems a little out of it. The party is obviously on edge, but they do share the space, moving to make some room, and they have a good perimeter around the camp, but now a couple of them are also paying attention to these 3 newcomers, just in case. Ludwig starts asking about the party, whether they are heading into the city, and when the party admits to heading towards Drakkenheim, he immediately offers them caution. He starts talking, and as he's talking, he's getting more and more distraught, visibly upset about some of the things that he's seen in the city. And he begins talking and hinting about some of the crazy monstrosities there. Some of their party members even fell to these. They lost 2 in the city of Drakkenheim. He briefly mentions the ratlings, and this is my first hint that there are rats of unusual size in this campaign. And then he also talks about the delirium, but when he is pressed about the delirium, he immediately clams up. Not that it's like a big secret, but he seems to just not want to dive into that subject anymore. Noct kind of notices, and he also notices that Endra is chiming in now and again, but Rakan is very out of it. Noct reaches out and tries to dispel any charm effects on the group, but in this case, his magic flares and nothing seems to happen. They all determine that, they've had enough talk for the night and they go to sleep, with Morgan on first watch. And it is during her watch that she sees Rakan start writhing on the ground. Throwing his cloak, he reveals that he has a tentacle in the place of a left arm. And as she stands to move over him, he rolls over and begins laying into Ludwig. The group wakes, and before the first round is even done, they do take out their first delirium dreg, which I didn't expect to be hard anyway. They are level 3 at this point, I should add. So they are a little bit ahead of where they really should be in this, but I didn't expect them to have trouble with it even at level 1. It was very fast and more of just an introduction to delirium and its effects. Morgan is furious and turns on Ludwig, demanding if he knows if it's contagious, if she's going to get sick as well. And Noct moves over to heal Ludwig, who is, barely holding on after being attacked. Armin begins his own interrogation, trying to calm Morgan, move her away since she is furious. Ludwig does admit that he knew that his friend was infected, but he does claim that it is not contagious. And he also just says that they weren't able to afford healing, that the prices in Emberwood were too steep, and they were hoping that by taking him away from the city and out of that haze and foul air, that maybe he would have just recovered naturally. They're not sure, as Harmon keeps pressing to fully understand how he got contaminated and started turning. And they cannot fully explain how he got infected, as they're not 100% sure themselves. They had been using gloves, they had been following the instructions on handling delirium, and he was the only one of the group, who remained at least, that got infected. As a precaution, Morgan cuts the tentacle arm off of the corpse and throws it into the fire. And Delilah starts talking about how she just needs to see the crater and get out. She doesn't want anything to do with these unnatural crystals or any of this contamination. Marlowe offers a last word of caution to the party about handling delirium, warning them that if they are going to deal with it, to make sure to stay protected. And then in the morning, they burn the rest of the body and split from Ludwig and Endra. They finally make their way to Emberwood. They escort Marlowe to the caravan circle, where she pays them, but also offers that they talk to Armin Gainsbury if they need any other kind of equipment or anything like that. And they run into a Miss Emily Crow, who is a very young, 10-year-old girl, who offers to take them around town and give them essentially the biggest information overload of the campaign, I feel like, so far. So they don't take in a lot, I'll be honest. But they do take note of a few things. They note the inns, so they mark Bark and Buzzard, which also Marlowe suggests renting a cabin from them to have a place to stay. They note the Skull and Sword Tavern, because Morgan always loves a good drink. They note the chapel, of course, because we have our own cleric who's also interested in the chapel. And then they also take note of the smithy, but pretty much avoid everything else aside from Evetide Manor, which, of course, our little Emily Crow talks about how haunted it is and how there are creepy noises and the doors open and shut and nobody goes in there. On their walk, they see Petra and Ansem, two young humans who actually look similar in appearance, possibly siblings of some sort. They don't interact with them, but they watch them walk into the watchtower, and they are wearing their hooded lanterns garb, denoting what faction they are a part of. This was information overload, so they don't really take in much else, but they decide to set up at the inn with the Bark and Buzzard to get their cabin, and they realize once they start talking to them that everything is 2 to 3 times more expensive. So they head to the Skull and Sword Tavern. Outside, they watch a couple of patrons go in, patting a jawless skull that is hanging next to the door, and offering some very macabre greetings to it as they walk in. Most of the party offer a similar greeting, except for Zelda, who looks at it very skeptically and just walks past it. She's slightly concerned that something will happen, but she also doesn't believe in it, so she walks through. They get some ale. Of course, Morgan threatens to arm wrestle some things, but the orcish tavern owner quickly shuts that down by threatening to close down her supply of ale to Morgan, which shuts her up immediately. They also meet a shady-looking fellow in the back of the tavern who is surrounded by several very bulky-looking guys who introduces himself as Blackjack Mel of the Queen's Men, and he seems to rub Harmon the wrong way. Mel claims that he has the best prices on delirium and that if they were to find any, they should definitely sell to him, who will definitely give them the best price, of course. He's super hesitant to chat further, saying things like, we best wait till you've experienced the city for yourself before we talk shop, eh? They end up leaving the tavern, and it's at this point that the party decides to split up for a little bit. So Harmon and Zelda leave to check out Evetide Manor, since it seems like there's something going on there. But the rest of the party stop at the chapel of Saint Ardina, following Nox's lead. The chapel is bright and beautiful, with the eternal flame brazier in the middle of this chapel. Delilah, who prides herself in being a part of the Old Faith, tries unsuccessfully to blow out the flame and is actually interrupted by Flamekeeper Hannah, who enters the room and begins chatting up Nox, noticing that he is wearing the symbol on his chest of Their Lady, and he starts asking about the general condition of the area, about contamination and things of that nature. She tells him that they're actively seeking the crystals to destroy, and she recommends that if they do decide to search for delirium, that they should try their best not to stay in the city into the evening, as that is when the haze is the strongest. And she also insists that they purchase and use some protective gear when handling any kind of delirium crystals. While that's happening, Harmon stops at the blacksmith with Zelda, and he commissions a lead box to be made about this big to hold the crystals that he can find, as well as he purchases some tongs. Zelda here tries to get the blacksmith to create her a special weapon, but she doesn't want to have to pay. She decides instead to try to intimidate Blacksmith Crow, and she does succeed. However, in my mind, despite her being intimidating, Crow wouldn't just back down. He has a family to protect who's waiting in the back room, and they are in his home, threatening him. So instead, I kind of use this as an opportunity to show that actions have consequences, and just because you do something doesn't mean, it happens or it'll always work out in your favor. Instead, Crow kind of takes a defensive stance between Zelda and the doorway to the rest of his abode, and he demands that she leaves. He is obviously afraid, but he's also not a coward. So he stands there waiting for her to leave, and Harmon very quickly smooths things over, and he is then told to return the next day to collect his box without Zelda. They then go to Evetide Manor, because this, of course, piques the interest of our young Zelda. And so she and Harmon stake out the place for a few hours, but they don't really discover much of anything. They do hear some doors open and shut, could be the wind, they're not sure. Zelda does try to approach the door, and she does end up finding a set of footprints leading away from the door, from the building, but she rolls poorly on any other attempts, so unfortunately does not gain anything else out of that. Finally, everyone regroups at their cabin for a long rest, and then in the morning, they stop out at Gainsbury Expeditionary Supply, which is in the caravan circle. They gather a comprehensive, very complete, well-written pamphlet on the ins and outs of delirium, as well as how to avoid contamination. It also alludes to the haze and its effect overnight. They also gather some gloves and other materials to help collect delirium. And then Zelda also buys a spyglass here before they all set off to Drakkenheim, which is where we start session 2. So let's talk about me, I guess. So here's a list of things I feel like I could have done better. So I think I did a good job of introducing the delirium is bad, but maybe too good, because it's not really the crystal that's bad, right? The crystal is it's just an item, okay? It's the people using the crystals that are bad, or could be good, I guess. Now, no one in the party, at the end of session 1, nobody in the party wants to do anything with delirium. And so it actually was hard to kind of direct them into the delirium hunt portion of this adventure. I think the only real reason I managed to get them to do that was because I made the price of everything super expensive, which I think is recommended in the book anyway, because everything is so expensive. And we also have Morgan, who is in debt up to her eyeballs. She kind of pushes everybody to go hunting for delirium so that she can sell it and make some money. It ended up being okay. But I do know that, especially with Delilah, she's gonna be stubborn about doing anything with delirium. There's a line there I have to straddle, and I'm still figuring that out even now. At this point, I'm into session 4, and I'm still having a little bit of back and forth there. I did mess up by suggesting that Hannah was a part of the Silver Order, because she doesn't care. She's supposed to be a neutral chapel in Emberwood. However, I don't know that that will matter in the long run. I tried to look and see if that would make a difference. And at this point, I could change it, and I'm sure most of the party wouldn't even realize it. Honestly, I think it'll be fine and it'll work out for the best this way. So I'm just going with it because it feels right, and we're just gonna keep going. The moment with the blacksmith, Crow, and Zelda, I'm kind of low-key proud of. I think that it was a good lesson for our youngest D&D player, because up until that point, she had been using thaumaturgy and other ways to intimidate people into getting what she wants. And while it was working most of the time, I don't want her to use that every time. I want her to be more creative with how she interacts with people, and I want her to ask more questions, which I have to also add, by session 2, she is doing more of. She actually started diving into the roleplay a little bit more. I'm not sure if it was because of this moment per se, but I thought that this also kind of pushed her to think of it a little differently, and to realize that just because she can do something doesn't mean that she should do something. Hopefully that was a good lesson, but we'll see. I don't know. Playing with a 10-year-old is offering a lot of different challenges for me, and I'm enjoying it because it's definitely, one, it's harder, right? Because I have to think like a 10-year-old, which I've forgotten how to think like that. And then 2, it's more fun because she is more creative with all of her spells and stuff. And so it ends up for some pretty cool moments. But that was one that I was like, hopefully I'm pushing her in the right direction, but we'll see. I am confused, at least at this point, and even now, I think, by session 4, I still don't really know like who's supposed to buy the delirium, who doesn't here. I'm having a hard time figuring out like the pricing of stuff, which I think means honestly that I need to fix my DM screen, because I have one of those, I have the original like 5e DM screen, okay? It's crap. I've wanted to get a nicer one. I also really would love to put a screen in mine. I'm so in between the world of digital and analog. It's a very strange way of existing in the D&D realm. Every time I look at DM screens, I'm like, I don't know. I feel like I could make my own, but I don't have time to make my own. So, maybe one day. But I might at least print out another sheet and just tack it on there with some of these prices, some of the stuff specific to this campaign. I also considered buying the Drakkenheim DM screen, but again, I don't know. Who has time? Not me. Another just general thing that was hard was that everyone in the family, except for my hubby, who was busy with also juggling a toddler running around the house, it was just that everybody was trying to help Zelda, our youngest player, and that meant especially certain people were like just talking at the same time I was talking to Zelda, and it was really, really hard for her to gather from both of us. And so that did lessen by the second session. That stopped happening as much. When I was talking, other people were quiet. Better, not perfect, which was good. It just was a little bit frustrating in this particular one, but also they're not used to me DMing. Normally I play in this campaign. I mean, I've DM'd a couple times for this group in general, but they're not used to me and I'm different than, Drake is behind the screen. So they have to get used to my style too. So I just let it go and it was fine. I did find that a little bit frustrating at first, but it is way easier. By session 2, it was like way easier. They got a little bit more used to the way I do things, and there was a little bit less of that. So that was good. At this point too, I had no clear indication of which factions I should be focused on. And that also offered me some anxiety, I guess, because there are 5 factions and I do think there's so much to each one. And I wanted to know them pretty well before they interacted with them, but it's hard to do that because mom brain. I can't remember crap. So how am I supposed to remember 5 different factions and all of their different goals and everything? It's just not possible. 2, I don't know. It's just like, I don't remember what 2 was. It was on here somewhere, but now I've lost it and it's fine. 2, I don't want to. I don't want to have to memorize all these things, and that's not how I like to play anyway. So yeah, I wish I had a little bit more of an indication which factions they were leaning towards. I did kind of narrow it down to 3, the Queensmen, although Harmon had that weird interaction with Blackjack Mel, so then I was like, well, maybe that's off the table, but they'll be around, so I should keep them in mind. And then the Silver Order was the obvious choice for Noct, especially with his personal quest on having to deal with the contamination. So that one stayed on the list. And then the Hooded Lanterns were also on the list, mostly because they had interact with them a little bit, but because of some Hooded Lanterns have a history of being from the Civil War, and Morgan has a history of being from the Civil War. So I thought she might lean towards that one, but it ended up being she was more trying to avoid them, as if she was embarrassed by her debt, but also worried that someone in the Hooded Lanterns might try to, come at her for that debt. At the end of session 1, I was like, I guess I just keep trying to learn all 5 of them. And then of course, I think I was a tad harsh on myself. Surprise, because I expected to learn everything about the world. And again, mom brain, so that's not happening. But 2, I'm learning this world just as much as everybody else is. So even though I've had weeks with this book, for me, the book is flat, because it's not like reading a story, right? It kind of is, but it's not as engrossing. So to me, it makes it flat. And so I can study the book as much as I want and all of that, but it doesn't really become a full-fledged world to me until the pieces in that world start moving. And so as soon as the players are in there messing stuff up, that's when the world itself becomes real in a sense. And it makes it easier for me to remember the details and make the world more convincing. All right, so prep for the next session. So this was hard. I didn't take as many notes as I normally do, and definitely regretted it in session 2. But I did try to review all the Drakkenheim city exploration stuff. I even rolled ahead of time for some things like encounters, just in case they happened upon them. And I wanted to make sure that I kind of fully understood how traversing Drakkenheim worked before letting them roam too much. At this point too, I was trying way too hard still to follow things by the book. And I don't think that makes for the best session. I feel like, again, it should be more like guidelines. So following the book too much hinders me and hinders my creativity. And so by session 3, I'm way more flexible. But honestly, I still feel like getting ready to go into session 4, I could do better, and have already tried to push myself to make this world more my own, if that makes sense. I really need to feel like the campaign is my own. I'm just trying to push myself into that instead. So instead of using all my copious amounts of notes, I ended up using the book a lot, which it just felt clunky by the end. It was fine, and we can talk about that in session 2.